Hello and welcome back to another GiantSlayer TFT Synergies tier list video. Today our analysts will be ranking each synergy from S all the way down to the C tier for patch 11.17. We'll be taking a look at which synergies are doing the best and which are struggling in the current meta. There has been a B patch, but it likely won't affect the meta too much as it's mostly reducing a few outlier champions' power to be more in line with the rest of the meta. With that, let's go ahead and dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our GiantSlayerTV social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Starting off our tier list, we have synergies in the S tier, which consists of Revenant, Ironclad, Mystic, Cruel, and Knight. Because there are no traits overly dominating the meta, S tier for 11.17 is a bit different. Yes, these traits are doing well, but this tier is focused on the best frontline and splash traits that are used in multiple compositions every single game. As we said, this tier focuses heavily on frontline, and no other synergy does that quite as well as Revenant. We're several weeks into the mid-set and deep into set 5, and still Revenant continues to be one of the most common and strongest late-game frontlines. There's just no getting around the fact that all three of Ivern, Volibear, and Fiddlesticks bring a ton of value to any board. They have CC damage, and due to the revival, they buy the backline a lot of extra time. Nocturne should also briefly be mentioned since Nocturne Assassin is doing well in the meta, but we'll talk more about him later. For the rest of the Revenants, we recommend using them as your front line whenever you can. Next, as usual, are the two most common splash traits, Ironclad and Mystic. Of the two, Ironclad certainly gains more value in the current meta with the emphasis on AD comps. But Mystic is always worthwhile to toss in if possible and a must-have against AP boards. Not much else to say about these two traits other than to recommend always scouting out to see which of the two you need in your lobby. Generally, we're reserved with our placement of Cruel and Teemo, but given the way the meta has developed, we can't ignore the impact this trait has on the late game. It's not really a splash trait, though it can be worthwhile to toss in Teemo onto your board if you have room. Why Cruel suddenly doing so well has a lot to do with the slower pace of the meta. There's a lot more focus on hitting level 8. Some players won't be all that healthy to play Teemo, but a good portion of the lobby will. And those that can afford a Teemo too get a huge advantage over the rest of the players. We still caution buying Teemo if you're on low health, but we do acknowledge the impact Teemo and Cruel have in the meta. And the last trait is back to the front line with Knights. It's debatable whether the synergy should be an S tier considering Revenants are so good, but the meta has shown that Knights are doing almost as well as Revenants for late game frontline. This is because the damage block is highly effective against non-burst champions like Vel'Koz Lucian or any low damage champion. Plus, Knights are all about stalling, particularly Galio. An itemized Galio extends the fight for a long time, buying time for champions like Jax, Aphelios, and Kayle to ramp up. We recommend trying out a Knight frontline in the late game if you're able to find a Galio too. Let's now move on to the A tier. This tier consists of Abomination, Ranger, Assassin, Redeemed, Legionnaire, Caretaker, Nightbringer, Sentinel, and Dawnbringer. Given there's no dominant meta right now, these synergies make up a bulk of the main comps we'll see in the meta. Abomination is still one of the top dog synergies during stage 2 and 3 with decent scaling into stage 4 and 5. It's not as great in the late game with Heimerdinger being a bit weaker and Vel'Koz being hit or miss, but it's at least playable. What puts Abomination so high on the tier list is the value of Nunu and Fiddlesticks on top of the stalling potential of the monstrosity. It's just an easy to run synergy to gain an advantage during the early portions of the game. Ranger is mostly doing well thanks to Aphelios and Akshan. Vayne has certainly brought up the value of the synergy with her reroll build, but since she's been nerfed in the B patch, her priority in the meta may fall. So it's all about the damage scaling of Aphelios and the 1v9 potential of Akshan. Overall, not the highest impact synergy, but two of the champions are staples of the meta. Assassin is a bit up in the air after the Nocturne nerf, but a 5 damage attack reduction doesn't always make a huge difference, though time will tell as players figure out the B patch meta. Still, ignoring the nerf for now, Nocturne and Assassins are one of the better compositions in the meta for how hard they can spike. And Nocturne is a Revenant, meaning you're going to use other Revenants, which is one of the best synergies. Redeemed. Redeemed suddenly went from being okay to being one of the best synergies thanks to Kayle, Aatrox, Rell, and Vel'Koz. The other champions are also quite good, so all around this synergy is full of top tier units. Of course, with the B patch, Aatrox is weaker, which may hurt the priority of Redeemed. That said, the late game is still where the synergy shines, particularly with a buffed Kayle and the ever-present Rell. Reworks can be hit or miss, and in the case of Legionnaire, it seems to be a hit as it improves several champions in the meta, most notably Kayle. If Kale wasn't doing well, then this synergy would be a bit lower, but for now, it is rated highly due to her presence in the late game. Unfortunately, Caretaker, or Heimerdinger, isn't doing as well in the meta after his mana was increased once again. Because it can take so long for him to cast, the impact of his ability is less, and sustained champions can often heal through it. That said, he's still one of the better late-game AP carries, which inherently increases his value. Nightbringer is sometimes referred to as a fake synergy, but we don't fully agree. The survivability it brings to all of its champions is amazing, and it increases their damage. Particularly, this is useful on Aphelios and makes for a lot of tense end-of-fight situations where the shield procs and Aphelios wipes out the entire board. The main issue of Nightbringer is Yasuo, as his presence is far less in the meta after the nerfs. Sentinel continues to be one of the strongest opening synergies, mostly thanks to Aurelia being a 3 synergy champion. Beyond that, the trait does fall off, though Lucian has been on the rise in the meta and Galio is becoming a staple mid to late game frontliner. But for the most part, this trait is in A tier because of its early game value. And lastly, for the A tier, we have Dawnbringer. It's hard to tell if this is the correct place for Dawnbringer because it's a trait that gets a ton of value from stages 2 to 4. Gragas, Kha'Zix, Nidalee, and Riven are such strong champions during those stages that the value of Dawnbringer goes up a lot. The late game is where the synergy struggles, particularly because of Riven 3 nerfs and Karma not being a playable champion. But since Dawnbringer influences the early stages of the game so much, we wanted to acknowledge it. Let's now move to the B tier. This tier consists of Hellion, Brawler, Forgotten, Skirmisher, Inanimate, Cavalier, Spellweaver, and Invoker. These are slightly weaker than traits in the A tier, but still have a place in the meta. At the top of the B tier, we have Hellions. Hellions took a nosedive in the meta after Tristana was nerfed, effectively killing the main comp for Hellions. Of course, she's still playable, but far less potent than before. Thankfully for Hellions, they have Lulu and Teemo to pull them up in value, and there is a Ziggs reroll build floating around. Not the best synergy, but definitely fitting in a tier devoted to average traits. For once, Brawler has lost value in the meta, mostly because Knights are the better frontline currently. That said, Gragas, Sejuani, and Nunu will always be worthwhile to run in the early game, with Nunu being the best of the 3 thanks to Abomination. Certainly not a weak synergy, there's just better frontlines in the mid to late game that overshadow it currently. Forgotten was doing well because of Vayne, but after the nerfs we're unsure of where it stands in the meta. Draven is still on the fringe of being viable, and Misfortune Cavaliers is mostly out of the meta entirely. Forgotten still provides enough value with a few possible compositions utilizing it that it's not terrible, but it's still on the brink of falling down into the C tier if there's any more negative changes. You may be thinking Skirmisher should be higher, but looking at the meta, it's not that common of a trait. Yes, Jax is doing well, but he only needs 3 Skirmishers, and the bulk of the composition around him is defensive synergies like Ironclad and Knights. Skirmisher really only gains value in stages 2 and 3 as a tag-along trait for Jax. It's not bad, but it's definitely below average. Gwen is doing well, but Inanimate still feels lacking, especially since Gwen herself doesn't need to get a lot of value from it. Perhaps if the aura moved with her or lasted after moving out of it, Inanimate would be more valuable. At the end of the day, it's still useful, it's just not amazing, especially compared to Gwen, who's so good on her own. Cavaliers, besides Rel of course, are taking a back seat in the meta as most other frontlines are just better all around. But as always, Rel is the shining star of this synergy and solely holds it up in the meta. It's still up in the air whether Spellweaver is stronger or not after the mini rework. In theory, it should be, but in practice, it doesn't seem like Spellweaver is doing all that well still. So put a pin in it for now, and we'll see how Spellweaver develops in the coming weeks, as it may rise up in priority once players figure out the best way to utilize the new changes to it. And lastly for B tier is Invoker. Invoker is great as a splash trade, but unfortunately it's limited because Karma is still doing poorly in the meta. That said, Teemo is a fantastic item holder, and Cruel is one of the better synergies, as well as Ivern with Revenant. That means it's not uncommon to see Invoker used, but as a mainstay splash trait, it's not anywhere near the priority in value of Ironclad and Mystic. Now we move on to our last tier, the C tier. This tier consists of Cannoneer, Victorious, Draconic, and Renewer. The synergies in C tier are highly situational, as they generally are only used in specific situations. First, we have Cannoneer. Cannoneer lost a lot of presence in the meta after both Tristana and Lucian were nerfed. Of course, we're now seeing Lucian slowly rise back up in the meta, but not enough to make Cannoneer all that appealing for most games. Unfortunately, this synergy rides and dies by how good Tristana and Lucian are, especially since neither Senna nor Misfortune gain much from it. Even though Knights are doing well, Victorious and Garen are not. There are situations where Garen is playable, but for a 5-cost frontliner, he's used far less than champions like Volibear or even a 4-cost unit like Rel. If Dawnbringers, specifically Karma, rise back up in value in the late game, then we may see Garen do well once again, but for now, he's a bit too niche to value higher than C tier. Then we have our usual floppy synergy Draconic. Up and down it goes on the wheel of value. The sad truth is that Draconic is always going to be a risky synergy because it's extremely volatile. The player has to hit the champions early game with good RNG on the eggs for Draconic to do anything useful. It can be good, or it can be a dead synergy. That volatility is why we generally have Draconic low on the list. And finally, we have Renewer. First off, 4 Renewers can be good. But how often do you see anyone utilizing 4 Renewers, especially without an emblem? The answer is rarely, if ever. Ivern is great, Heimerdinger is great, but the rest of them are situational at best, especially after Rakan 3 was nerfed. If there was an easier way to comfortably play 4 Renewers, the synergy would be a lot better, but since that doesn't seem likely to happen, then we expect to see Renewer continue to be near the bottom every patch. That's all we have for today's tier list video. Overall, the meta is in a great place as a lot of different synergies are playable, with no one synergy being vastly better than another. Most synergies can be used depending on the situation, which makes for a fun and flexible meta. Let us know what you think about the current meta in the comment section below. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.